Okay, well, I thought this time that I would actually cover some of the biblical stories. So, and hopefully a number of them. As I said last time, I'm going to go through this, well, as fast as I am able to. I want to do it as complete a job as possible. And of course, the probability that I'll get through the entire Bible is very low. But we'll get through a lot of the major stories in the beginning of it, and that's a good start. And then, you know, assuming that this all goes well, then maybe I'll try to do the same thing again, either in the fall or next year. So, assuming that everything is still working out properly next year. It's a long ways away. All right, so I guess we'll start. So last week, I talked to you about a line in the New Testament that was from John, and it was a line that was designed to parallel the opening of Genesis, and it's a really important line, and I thought I would re-emphasize it because the Bible is a book that's been written forward and backwards in time in some sense, like most books, because if you write a book, of course, when you get to the end, if you're the writer, you can adjust the beginning and so on. So it has this appearance of linearity, but it isn't linear. It's like you're God in some sense standing outside of time. That's your book, and you can play with time anywhere along it. And the people who put the book together, or the books together, took full advantage of that, and that makes the story, it gives the story odd parallels in many, many places, in a very large number of places. And this is one of the major parallels, at least from the perspective of the Christian interpretation of the Bible, which of course includes the New Testament. And so there's this strange idea that Christ was the same factor or force that God used at the beginning of time to speak habitable order into being. And that's a very, very strange idea. You know, it's not something that can be just easily dismissed as superstition, partly because it's so strange. It doesn't even fit the definition of like a superstitious belief. It's a dreamlike belief in some sense. And what I see many of the ideas in the Bible as is these dreamlike ideas that underlie our normative cognition and that constitute the ground from which our more articulated and explicit ideas have emerged. And this one's so complicated, this idea is so complicated that it's still mostly embedded in dreamlike form, but it seems to have something to do with the primacy of consciousness. And this is one of the biggest issues regarding the structure of reality, as far as I can tell, because everyone from physicists to neurobiologists debates this. There's the stumbling block for a purely objective view of the world seems to me to be consciousness. And consciousness has all sorts of strange properties. For example, it isn't obvious what constitutes time, or at least duration, in the absence of consciousness. And it isn't also easy to understand what constitutes being in the absence of consciousness, because it seems to be the case, well, if a movie is running and there's no one to watch it, I know it sounds like the tree in the forest idea, but it's not that idea at all. If a movie is running and no one's watching it, in what sense can you say that there's even a movie running? Because the movie seems to be the experience of the movie, not the objective elements of the movie. And there's something about the world, at least insofar as we're in it as human beings, that is dependent on conscious experience of the world. Now, of course, you can take consciousness out of the world and say, well, if none of us were here, if there was no such thing as consciousness, then the cosmos would continue running the way it is running. But of course, it depends on what exactly you mean by the cosmos when you make a statement like that, because there's something about the subjective experience of reality that gives it reality. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. And since we're all pretty enamored of our own consciousnesses, although they're painful because they define our being, it's not unreasonable to give consciousness a kind of metaphysical primacy. Now, and it's deeper than that, you know, it's a deeper idea than that, because there are physicists, and they're not trivial physicists like John Wheeler, who believes that in some sense consciousness plays a constitutive role in transforming the chaotic potential of being into the actuality of being. And he actually thinks about it, he's not alive anymore, but he actually thought about it as playing a constitutive role, you know. And then from the neurobiological perspective or from the scientific perspective, it's like consciousness is not something we understand. I don't think we understand it at all. It's something we can't get a handle on with our fundamental materialist philosophy. And I don't know why that is. It's quite frustrating if you're a scientist, but it isn't clear to me that we've made any progress whatsoever in understanding consciousness, even though, well, we've been trying to understand it for hundreds of years, and even though psychologists and neurobiologists and so forth have really put a lot of effort into understanding consciousness from a scientific perspective in the last 50 years. So anyways, what it seems to me is the idea that God used the word to extract order out of, habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time, which is roughly the right way of thinking about it, seems to me deeply allied with the idea that what it is that we do as human beings is encounter something like a formless and potential chaos. I mean, we're not omniscient, obviously, and we can't just do whatever we want, but we encounter a formless and chaotic potential. That's always what we're grappling with, and somehow we use our consciousness to give that form. And this is how people act. Like, if you look at how they regard themselves, it's how they act, because you say things to people like, well, you should live up to your potential. And you make a case that there's something about a person that's more than what is, that yet could be if only they participated in the process properly. And everyone knows what that means, and no one acts like a mystery has been uttered when you say that. And you can see a situation in your own life that's full of potential. You're often extremely excited when you encounter something that's full of potential, because what you see is something that could be. You see a future beckoning for you that could be if only you interacted with it properly. And it activates your nervous system, right, in a very basic way. And we even understand how that happens to the degree that we understand how the nervous system works, because the systems that mediate positive emotion, which are governed roughly by the neurochemical dopamine, and which have their roots way down in the ancient hypothalamus, a very, very archaic and fundamental part of the brain, that responds to potential, which is the possibility of accruing something new and valuable. It responds to potential with active movement forward and engagement. And so we're engaged in the world as potential, and it looks like consciousness does that. And so there's this idea that, and this is the main idea that I think is being put forth in Genesis 1. It's something like, and you see this in mythology, like from what I've been able to gather, there's always three causal elements that make up being at the bottom of world mythology. And one is the formless potential that makes up being once it's interacted with, and that's generally given a feminine nature. And I think that's because it's like the source from which all things emerge and rise. It's something like that. It's more complicated than that, but it's something like that. And then there's some kind of interpretive structure that has to grapple with that formless potential. And I think that's the sort of thing that was alluded to by Immanuel Kant when he was criticizing the notion that all of our information comes from sense data, which would be the pure empirical perspective, right? Because when you encounter the world, you encounter it with a cognitive structure that already has shape. And so it's already in you, this structure. And without that a priori structure, you wouldn't be able to take the formless potential and give it structure. And I think that's something, it's akin in some way to the idea of God the Father. And I'll try to develop that idea more. It's the notion that there's something in all of us that transcends all of us, that's deeply structural, that's part of this ancient, well, I would say evolutionary and cultural process that enables us to grapple with the formless potential and bring forth reality, roughly speaking. And then there's the final element, and that element seems to be something like consciousness itself, the consciousness that actually inheres in the individual. So it's not only that you have a structure, it's that the structure has the capacity for action in the world. And it's like, you're the spirit that gives the dead structure life. It's something like that. And as far as I can tell, the Trinitarian notion that characterizes Christianity is something like, well, formless potential, which is never given the status of a deity in Christianity. And then the notion that there's an a priori interpretive structure that's a consequence of our ancient existence as beings. It goes back as far in time as you can go, the notion of a structure. And then the idea of a consciousness that is the tool of that structure and that interacts with the world and gives it and gives it reality. And that's the Word, as far as I can tell. And so the notion is that there's a Father, and that's the structure, and there's a Son that's transcendent, that characterizes consciousness itself, and that it's the Son, the speaking of the Son, that is the active principle that turns chaos into order. And God, it's such a sophisticated idea as far as I'm concerned, because, well, there's something about it that's at least phenomenologically accurate, because you do have an interpretive structure, and you couldn't understand anything without it. Your very body is an interpretive structure, right? It's been crafted over, let's say, 3 billion years of evolution. Without that, you wouldn't be able to perceive anything, and it's taken a lot of death and struggle and tragedy to produce you, the thing that's capable of encountering this immense chaos that surrounds us, and to transform it into habitable order. And then there's the idea too, of course, that's deeply embedded in the first chapters of Genesis, which is a staggering idea, you know, and certainly not one that's likely, that human beings were made in the image of God, both male and female were made in the image of God. And that's, of course, a very difficult thing to understand, partly because the God that's referred to in those chapters has a kind of polytheistic element, although it's an element that's moving rapidly towards a unified monotheism. But it's not also obvious to me why people would come up with that concept, because I don't really think that when we think about each other, we immediately think God-like. You know, the notion that every single human being, regardless of their peculiarities and strangenesses and sins and crimes and all of that, has something divine in them that needs to be regarded with respect, and that plays an integral role, at least an analogous role, in the creation of habitable order out of chaos. That's a magnificent, remarkable, crazy idea. And yet we developed it, and I do firmly believe that it sits at the base of our legal system. I think it is the cornerstone of our legal system. That's the notion that everyone is equal before God, which is, of course, that's such a strange idea. It's very difficult to understand how anybody could have ever come up with that idea, because the manifold differences between people are so obvious and so evident that you could say the natural way of viewing someone is, or human beings, is in this extremely hierarchical manner, where some people are contemptible and easily brushed off as pointless and pathological and without value whatsoever, and all the power accrues to a certain tiny, you know, aristocratic minority at the top. But if you look at the way that the idea of the individual sovereignty developed, it's clear that it unfolded over thousands and perhaps 10,000s of years before it became something firmly fixed in the imagination, that each individual had something of transcendent value about them. And man, I tell you, we dispense with that idea at our serious peril. And so, and if you're going to take that idea seriously, then, which you do because you act it out, because otherwise you wouldn't be law-abiding citizens, right? You act that idea out. It's firmly shared by everyone who acts in a civilized manner. The question is, why in the world do you believe it, assuming that you believe what you act out, which I think is a really good way of fundamentally defining belief. So, all right, so that's the sort of idea, is that there's this God of tradition and structure. That's God the Father, who uses the Son, which is more of an active force, and primarily something that's verbal, which I also think is extremely interesting, because it's associated not with thought precisely, but with speech. And I think the reason for that is that there's something to speech that's more than mere thought. And I think part of the reason for that is that speech is a public utterance. And at least in principle, speech is something that's shaped by the existence of everyone else, at least across time. Because when you speak, your speech is put forward in the world as a causal element, and it's also subject to criticism and cooperation and mutual shaping. And so there's an idea here too that speech is that the cognitive processes that bring habitable reality out of uninhabitable chaos have this collective and public element, which is part of the reason, by the way, that I'm an advocate of free speech, let's say, above all, because I don't think, although it is the case, for example, in the Canadian Bill of Rights, that every single right has equal value. That's the theory. It's an idiotic theory, because it's absolutely impossible for a large set of rights to have absolutely equal stances. That cannot happen. There's no way that that can ever work. But that is the legal judgment. But I think it's a huge mistake, because free speech has this, well, this divine quality, let's say, that you can't escape from, because it's the thing that manufactures everything else. You know, and I do think that the dream that you could think of as encapsulated in the stories in Genesis is the dream by which human beings dreamed up the idea that we would now consider consciousness. Because, you know, it took us a long time to figure out the word consciousness. It's not like it's bloody obvious. Who knows how many thousands of years, or who knows what struggles we had to undertake to abstract out something like consciousness, and how we had to represent that dramatically, say, or symbolically, or in a dreamlike fashion before we could actually formulate the term and localize that to some degree in people. It's very sophisticated. So John makes the case that, well, there's an emanation of God, or an element of God, the transcendent consciousness, it's something like that, that acts directly and in a sort of living way with the underlying potential of the world. And I think that that's phenomenologically accurate, and I do think that that's the way we regard our lives. Because, you know, when you think about it too, we tend to think that what you encounter when you're looking at the world is the material world, but that isn't how you act. You do act as if you're in a place of potential, and also in a place of potential that you can actually transform, which is also something extraordinarily strange, you know, because we do treat each other as if we're capable of bringing new forms into the world in some permanent manner, right? And we treat each other as if we have free choice and free will, and perhaps we don't. But it's certainly the case that societies that are predicated on the idea that we don't do very well. And societies that are predicated on the idea that we do seem to do a lot better. Plus, people tend to get very annoyed at you if you treat them like they're automatons that lack free will. There's something that people find very, I would say, constraining, slave-like about that even. You know, that the demand that you don't have actual autonomy, and even worse, that you're not responsible for your choices. It's an insult to someone to suggest to them that they're not responsible for their choices. You know, you usually, to do that to someone from a legal perspective, you have to argue something like diminished capacity, right? Well, you're mentally ill, or you don't have the intellectual capacity, or you were addled by some substance, or you had a brain injury or something, and that's why you're not responsible for your actions. Otherwise, part of the respect that you give to another human being is the assumption that they're responsible for their actions. And some of that can be, well, if you do something bad, then you're responsible for it. But part of that, too, is that if you do something good, you're also responsible for that. And that also seems necessary, because, I mean, it's got to be more annoying than anything else you can imagine to strive virtuously, let's say, to produce something of extreme value, and then to be treated as if that was a mere deterministic outcome, and that your actual choices had nothing to do with that. I mean, people find that sort of thing extraordinarily punishing. And so I'm willing to, you know, I mean, I know that there are debates about all these things, and debates about free will, and debates about the nature of consciousness, but I'm trying to take a clear look at how people act and how they want to be treated, and then to trace it back to these old ideas to see if there's some metaphysical, let's say, metaphysical connection. So, all right, so here's how the book opens. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, this is a hard, what would you call, narrative section to get a handle on, because in order to understand it properly, you have to actually look behind it. So there are a lot of pieces of old stories in the Old Testament that flesh out the meaning of these lines. And I can give you a quick overview of it. One of the ideas that lurks underneath these lines, although you can't tell because it's in English, you have to look at the original languages, and of course I don't speak the original languages, so I've had to use secondary sources. Too bad for me. But the without form and void and the deep idea, you see, that's associated with this notion of endless deep potential. So for example, the words that are used to represent without form and void are something like, well, one is I'm going to get this partly wrong, tohu wabohu, and another one is teom. And it's important to know this because those words are associated with an earlier Mesopotamian word, which is Tiamat. And Tiamat was a dragon-like creature who represented the salt water. And Tiamat had a husband named Apsu, and Tiamat and Apsu were sort of locked together in kind of a sexual embrace. And it was that locking together of Tiamat and Apsu, and I would say that's potential and order, something like that, or chaos and order. They were locked together, and it was that union of chaos and order that gave rise in the old Mesopotamian myth, which is the Anu Melish, to being, to the old gods first, and then eventually, as creation progressed, to human beings themselves. And so there's this idea lurking underneath these initial lines that God is akin to that which confronts the unknown and carves it into pieces and makes the world out of its pieces. And the thing that it confronts is something like it's something like a predatory reptile, or it's something like a dragon, or it's something like a serpent. And I think part of the reason for that, and this is a very deep and ancient idea, is that this is where it gets so complicated to do the translation, is partly that is how human beings created our world. Like, we went out beyond the confines of our safe spaces, let's say. Our safe spaces defined by the tree or defined by the fire. And we actively voyaged outward to the places that we were afraid of and didn't understand, and conquered and encountered things out there, like literally animals, like mammoths and snakes and predators of all sorts. And it was as a consequence of that active, brave engagement with the domain of what we did not understand, the terrifying domain of what we did not understand, that the world in fact was generated. And that idea lurks deeply inside the opening lines of Genesis. And it's a profound idea in my estimation. And I think also that the way our brains are structured, and this is something that I'm going to try to develop more today, is that the ancient circuits that our ancestors used to deal with the space beyond which they had already explored, so that would be home territory. So that's that unknown territory that's characterized by promise, because there are new things out there, but also by intense danger, right? Because we're prey animals, especially millions of years ago when we were very young. We had to go out there and encounter things that were terribly dangerous. And there was a kind of, let's say, paternal courage that went along with that. And it was the spirit of paternal courage that enabled the conquering of the unknown. And there's no difference between the conquering of the unknown and the creation of habitable order. And the thing is that as our cognitive faculties have developed to the point where we're capable of very high levels of abstraction, the underlying biological architecture has remained the same. And so I don't think that it's too much to say at all that the circuits that engage you, for example, when you're having an argument about something fundamental with someone that you love, and so you're trying to structure the world around you jointly to create a habitable space that you can both exist within, you're using the same circuits, the abstracted version, you're using the same circuits that our archaic ancestors would have used when they went out into the unknown itself to encounter beasts and predators and geographical unknowns. It's the same circuit. It's just that we do it abstractly now instead of concretely. But of course it has to be the same circuit, because evolution is a very conservative force. And what else would it be? And this is also why I think it's so easy for us to demonize those people who are our enemies, because our enemies confront us with what we don't want to see. And because of that, our first response is to use snake detection circuitry on them, and that accounts for our capacity, almost immediate capacity, to demonize. And there's a reason for that. It's not a trivial thing. First of all, it's a very fast response, and second of all, it's a response that has worked for a very, very, very long time. And so, one of the variants of the hero, and I would consider a variant of the hero like a fragment of the picture of God, is the heroic warrior who slays the enemy, right? And of course, that's not precisely a politically correct representation of the hero in modern times. And no wonder, but it's still something that you go watch in movies all the time and admire, right? It's like this one of the how many plots are there? Romance and adventure, that's about it. And most of the adventure genre is, well, there's some enemy that's lurking in some form. It could be human, it could be alien, and someone rises up to go and confront it and maintain order. You know, it's like, there's no getting away from that story. And if you don't have that in your own life, then you play a video game where that's happening, or you watch a movie where that's happening, or you read a book where that's happening, and it captures you, even if you're atheistic and your only religion is Star Wars, you know? And it's still, well, really, right? It still captures your imagination, and you act like someone who's possessed by religious fervor when you line up for 3 days to be the first one into the theater, you know? And all the while claiming that you're atheistic to the core. It's like... Okay, so this without form and void is this chaotic, and it's a hard thing to get a grip on, you know, what exactly this means. But I can give you another kind of example of how you would experience the formless chaos of potential in your own lives, and even how the order that you currently inhabit can dissolve into that. And you know, in Dante's Inferno, when he outlined the levels of hell, so Dante was trying to get to the bottom of what constituted evil, really, in this representation. So it's a work of psychology, and he was thinking, well, there are various ways to behave reprehensibly, but there's a hierarchy of reprehensible behavior, and there's something absolutely the worst at the bottom. And Dante believed that it was betrayal. And I think that's right, because, you know, one of the things that enables long-term cooperation, peaceful cooperation between people is trust. And I would also say that trust is the fundamental natural resource. There's been some very good books written on the economic utility of trust, for example, and societies where the default economic presupposition between trading partners is trust tend to be rich, even if they don't have any natural resources. And you can see that, for example, with what happened with eBay, which I think was a kind of miracle, because what should have happened with eBay was that you sent me junk and I sent you a check that bounced, right? And that was the end of eBay. But, right, exactly. But that isn't what happened. Like the default transaction on eBay was so honest that the brokers, you could hire brokers to begin with. I can't remember what they were called exactly, but you could pay someone a fee so that they would guarantee the transaction. So, you know, you wouldn't send me junk and I'd actually send you a payment, and we'd pay 10% for someone to guarantee that. The default trade was so honest that those things vanished right away. And so that meant that all this frozen capital, roughly speaking, which were all the junk that people had lying around that someone else might want, instantly became money. And the only reason that worked was because people trusted one another. And so trust is an unbelievably powerful economic force, maybe the most powerful economic force. Anyways, if you have a relationship with someone, it's predicated on trust. And part of the reason for that is that trust is what enables us to look at each other without running away screaming. And what I mean by that is that if I trust you, then I don't have to take into account how complicated you are, because you're horribly complicated. You know, I think chimpanzee full of snakes, that's what a human being is. And as long as you'll do what you say you'll do, then I can take you at your word, and your word simplifies you, and you can take me at my word, and my word simplifies you, and then we can act like we understand each other even though we don't. But then if that trust is betrayed, then all the snakes come forth very, very rapidly. And so all of you, I suspect, have been betrayed one way or another. And so what happens, if you're in a relationship with someone and you trust them, then you make certain assumptions about the past, and you make certain assumptions about the present, and you make certain assumptions about the future. And everything's stable, and so you're standing on solid ground. And the chaos, it's like you're standing on thin ice. The chaos is hidden. The shark beneath the waves isn't there. You're safe. You're in the lifeboat. But then if the person betrays you, like if you're in an intimate relationship and the person has an affair and you find out about it, then you think, one moment you're one place, right? You're where everything is secure because you've predicated your perception of the world on the axiom of trust. And the next second, really, the next second, you're in a completely different place. And not only is that place different right now, the place you were years ago is different, and the place you're going to be in the future, years hence, is different. And so all of that certainty, that strange certainty that you inhabit, can collapse into incredible complexity. And you say, well, if someone betrays you, you think, well, okay, who were you? Because you weren't who I thought you were. And I thought I knew you, but I didn't know you at all. And I never knew you, and so all the things we did together, those weren't the things that I thought were happening. Something else was happening, and you were someone else. And that means I'm someone else because I thought I knew what was going on, and clearly I don't. I'm some sort of blind sucker or the victim of a psychopath or someone who's so naive that they can barely live. And I don't understand anything about human beings, and I don't understand anything about myself. And I have no idea where I am now. I thought I was at home, but I'm not. I'm in a house, and it's full of strangers. And I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. It's like all of that certainty, that habitable certainty, collapses right back into the potential from which it emerged. And that's a terrifying thing. That's a journey to the underworld from a mythological perspective. And that is really something worth knowing. Because, you know, journeys to the underworld are extraordinarily common in mythological stories. And, you know, like the Hobbit going out to find the Smog, the dragon, and get the gold is a journey into the underworld. And journeys to the underworld happen all the time. And modern people don't understand what the underworld is, except that we've all been there. And we go there all the time. And we go there every time the solidity and stability of the world that we've erected, at least partly through our speech, is shattered because, well, some sort of snake appears. That's another way of thinking about it, and it's a really good way of thinking about it because, you know, no matter how carefully you construct the little habitable area that's around you, there's always something you didn't take into account, and there's always something that can pop up its head and do you in and make you aware of your mortality and age you for that matter, or even kill you. And that's the permanent situation of life, which is part of the reason why I think the story of Adam and Eve, for example, is archetypal. It's because we do inhabit walled gardens, right? Because a walled garden is half structure, society, and half nature. That's what a walled garden is. And a walled garden is a place of paradise and warmth and love and sustenance, but it's also the place where something can pop up at any moment and knock you out of it. And I think part of the reason that that story exists at the beginning of this collection of books is because it explains the eternal situation of human beings. We're always in that situation. We're in a walled garden, or we bloody well hope we are. But there's always a snake. And then it's even worse, because if there is a snake, we're exactly the sort of creatures who are going to do nothing but go and interact with that snake the second that we can manage it. You know, it's definitely the case that if you want a human being to muck around with something, the best thing to do is to tell them not ever to do it, have anything to do with it, which is, of course, something you know if you have teenagers or even children, or if you know anything about yourself or your partner. So these stories are trying to express what you might describe as an unchanging, transcendent reality. You know, it's something like what's common across all human experience across all time. And that's what Jung essentially meant by an archetype. And you could say, well, you know, we tend to think that what we see with our senses is real. And of course that's true, but what we see with our senses is what's real that works at the time frame that we exist in, right? And so we see things that we can touch and pick up. We see tools, essentially, that are useful for our moment-to-moment activities. We don't see the structures of eternity, especially not the abstract structures of eternity. We have to imagine those with our imagination. Well, and that's partly what these stories are doing. They're saying, well, there's forms of stability that transcend our capacity to observe, which is hardly surprising. We know that if we're scientists, right? Because we're always abstracting out things that we can't immediately observe. But there are metaphysical or moral realities or phenomenological realities that have the same nature, that you can't see them in your life by observing them with your senses, but you can imagine them with your imagination. And sometimes the things that you imagine with your imagination are more real than the things that you see. Well, numbers are like that, for example. I mean, there's endless examples of that. And I would say, well, this is also a good way of thinking about fiction, because a good work of fiction is more real than the stories from which it was derived. Otherwise, it has no staying power, right? It's distilled reality, even though, in some sense, it never happened. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean by happened. You know, it's a pattern that repeats in many, many places with variation. You extract out the central pattern. It's the pattern purely never existed in any specific form, But the fact that you've pulled a pattern out from all those exemplars means that you've extracted something real. And I think the reason that the story of Adam and Eve, which we'll talk about in quite a bit of detail today, has been immune to being forgotten is because it says things about the nature of the human condition that are always true. I can give you another brief example. You know, like, people have a lot of guilt. You know, there's a line of social psychology that claims that most people feel that they're better than other people. And like, I just don't buy that. That isn't what I've seen in my life. And maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm a clinical psychologist and I see more people who are overtly suffering, maybe, than people do in general. Although I'm not so sure about that, you know, because you don't have to scratch very far beneath the surface of most people's lives before you find something truly tragic. And I don't mean the sort of tragedy that you whine about. I mean, you know, your mother has Alzheimer's, or your best friend committed suicide, or you have a close relative with cancer, or you have a sick child, or, you know, there's something wrong with you, because almost everyone has at least one really terrible thing wrong with them. And if you don't, hey, you will, so, you know. So, you know, that tragic sense of being is there with people all the time. And it's also the case that in my experience, like, I rarely meet someone who says, hey, you know, I'm doing everything I possibly can, I'm a hell of a guy, and I can't see how I could possibly improve, you know? You meet someone like that, you think they're narcissistic, right? And you're right. But most people don't feel that way. They feel like they could do a hell of a lot better than they are, and they're quite acutely aware of their faults, and they don't feel that they're what they should be. And you see, what happens in the story of Adam and Eve as well is that when people become self-conscious, at least that's how it looks to me, they get thrown out of paradise, and then they're in history. And history is a place where there's pain in childbirth, and where you're dominated by your mate, and where you have to toil like mad, like no other animal, because you're aware of the future. You have to work and sacrifice the joys of the present for the future constantly, and you know you're going to die, and you have all that weight on you. And to me, again, that's just, how can anything be more true than that? That's just, as far as I can tell, that's just how it is. Unless you're naive beyond comprehension, there's something about your life that is echoed in that representation. And why it is that, I mean, we're such strange creatures because we don't seem to really fit into being in some sense. And that's also what's expressed in the notion of the fall. The existentialists said, well, people feel like they have a debt that they have to pay off to existence for the crime of their being, something like that. And maybe it's because we're acutely aware that we have to offer something of value to the people around us so that they can tolerate us, you know, while we're going about our business. But it seems deeper than that. It's that human beings seem to exist in a post-cataclysmic world, and that's exactly also what's represented in Genesis. And it's very interesting because, you know, in the Adam and Eve story, there's two catastrophes, essentially. There's the catastrophe that occurs when Adam and Eve wake up, which we'll talk about in detail, and become self-conscious and know that they're naked. And their eyes are open, right? So that's the terminology that's used. And to have your eyes open means to have an increment in consciousness, essentially, because eyes are associated with consciousness for human beings because we're intensely visual animals. And so the metaphor of having your eyes opened is the same as the metaphor of coming to consciousness. And as soon as Adam and Eve come to consciousness, they realize they're naked. And, you know, the classic interpretation of that is that it has something to do with sexual sin. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that that's what it means, although there are elements about that are relevant. It's more that to realize that you're naked, it's like, you know, if you dream that you're naked on a stage in front of people, that's not a sexual dream, man, unless you're some kind of strange exhibitionist, right? It's you want to cover yourself up and get the hell off that stage as fast as possible. And so to be naked in front of a crowd is to have everyone, it's to have the judgment of the social world focused on your self-evident inadequacies. And that makes people self-conscious, and that's a real human state. It's associated with neuroticism in the Big Five trait model. But people don't like that at all. They don't like having their fragility and vulnerability exposed to the group. It's one of the two major fears of people, because one is social humiliation, and the other is something like mortality and death. And like your typical agoraphobic, for example, gets to have both those fears at the same time, because it's usually a she, tends to believe she's going to have a very spectacular and exhibitionistic heart attack in a public place and make a terrible fool of herself while she's dying. So, and then that's a good example of the two archetypal fears that characterize human beings. So to me, and I said that I tried to approach these stories as if I didn't know what they were about, because that seemed right to me. Because they're mysteries, everything about them is mysterious, and why we have them is mysterious, and what the hell you're all doing here is mysterious, you know, listening to this lecture. And so, and reading Jung, because Carl Jung was very, very helpful in this, because he faced these stories with a beginner's mind and presumed there was something to him that he didn't understand, given that they were at the very bloody bottom of our civilization, you know, which is historically perfectly clear, and that they came out of the midst of time. And he wasn't satisfied with the idea, the Freudian idea that God was just the father, or the Marxist idea that religion was the opiate of the masses. It's like, if religion was the opiate of the masses, then communism was the methamphetamine of the masses, I can tell you that. So, you know, you've been betrayed by someone, and so you fall into that underworld of doubt about everything. And it's a serious place to be in that underworld, because not only do you not know where you came from, or who you are, or where you're going, that's bad enough. So that's the underworld itself. But there's a subdivision of the underworld, like the worst suburb, which is, I think, what hell is, essentially, from a metaphysical perspective. Because, you know, if someone really cuts you off at the knees, especially if they do it in a malevolent way, and if you're going to be betrayed, and you really want to be betrayed properly, you want to be betrayed by someone who's really out to hurt you. You know, they just weren't being stupid. They were, like, after you for whatever reason. And then that's also, you plunge into that underworld space, and that's also when you start to nurse feelings of resentment and aggrievement and murder and homicide, and even worse, you know, because if people are betrayed enough, they start to obsess about the utility of being itself, and perhaps go to places that no one would ever want to go if they were in their right mind, and to develop and nurse fantasies of the ultimate revenge. And that's a horrible place to be, and that's hell as far as I can tell. And that's why hell has always been a suburb of the underworld, because if you get plunged into a situation that you don't understand and things are not good for you anymore, it's one step from being completely confused. It's only one step from being completely confused to being completely outraged and resentful, and then it's only one step from there to really looking for revenge. And that can take you places that, well, that merely to imagine properly can be traumatic. And I've seen that happen with people many times. And I think that anybody who uses their imagination on themselves can see how that happens, because I don't imagine there's a single person in the room that hasn't nursed fairly intense fantasies of revenge, at least at one point in their life. And usually, you know, for what appear to be good reasons. It's no picnic to get betrayed, that's for sure, and it can shake your faith in being, but if it shakes it so badly that you turn against being itself, that's certainly no solution, that's for sure. All it does is make everything that's bad even worse. So, okay, now, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And so that's another fundamental separation, right? Light and darkness. Those are in some sense the two of the fundamental elements of our conscious being, because of course when it's light we're awake and conscious because we're diurnal animals, and when it's night, well, then we're asleep. And so our existence is bounded by light and darkness. We're up and alert when it's light, and that's partly because we're highly visual animals, right? Unlike most animals, because most animals use smell, we use vision. We're very strange that way. And vision is associated with enlightenment and illumination, and with the breaking of the dawn, and with the coming of the new day, and all of that. So for light to be created is associated in some sense with the emergence of conscious being. And so that's another echo of that notion. And the particular phrasing of the story also is important, because it's again that God said, right? So that's the use of that word, and that's the active element of the structure that gives order to chaos. It's something like that. So it's like the spirit of the structure manifests itself, and produces the fundamental divisions of experience. That's what's being presented here. And God separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And again, the fact that things are named is also very important. So you see this later with Adam, because God gives Adam the job of naming all the animals. And it's sort of like the animals don't actually exist in some sense till they're named. And that's another indication of the authors of the Bible's attempt to come to terms with the fact that our cognitive faculties and our ability to speak have something to do with the way that we cast chaotic potential into actuality, right? Because we can't really get a grip on something before we have a name for it, which is why, for example, you all have names, and everything that you encounter has to have a name, because before it has a name, it's just kind of part of the blurry background. It's something like that. And you could say it exists before it has a name, and that's true, but it's also true that it doesn't exist before it has a name. Because as soon as you give something a name, its nature changes, and you've transformed it into something that's not so much mere potential anymore, but it's at least on its way to being actuality. It's on its way to being a tool. And so the act of naming is repeated continually in the first chapters of the Bible, and the reason for that is this continued emphasis on the importance of consciousness and conscious articulation and speech. You know, and speech is really something that does separate us in an important way from animals. You know, like we haven't got very far teaching animals how to speak. The best we've managed so far is some parrots, right? There's a gray African parrot. There was one of them that got up to about a 4-year-old level, and that's mind-boggling, because like, how big is the brain of a parrot? It's like that big, and that bloody thing could talk, and so that shows you how much we know about brains. But I know they're small and all that, and we tried teaching chimpanzees to talk, and they could kind of get somewhere with sign language, especially if you started when they were young, but they don't have the capacity for language like we do, and they were never able to really pass it on to the next generation, which is obviously a critical element of really having that ability. So human beings, we've used our linguistic capacity to parse up the world in a new way and to conceptualize it in a new way. And you know, you can say that we're just like ants on this little trivial planet out on the edge of one of 100 million galaxies, and that what's happening here has no cosmic significance. But that's an arbitrary proposition, you know? I mean, we're very complicated things, and whatever's going on this planet has to do with conscious reality. And the transformations of consciousness, for all we know, might be the most important things that happen everywhere. There's no reason to consider consciousness a trivial phenomenon. I mean, it's taken 3.5 billion years for you to develop the brain that you've developed. And human beings are amazing creatures. I mean, just a casual walk through YouTube and all those crazy kids that climb cranes and do that. What's that? Yeah, parkour, man. That stuff's unbelievable, you know? I mean, human beings are crazy, crazy animals. There's almost nothing we can't do. And I'm very loath to assume that the transformations of consciousness that are described in the early stories in the biblical accounts are somehow cosmically trivial. It doesn't strike me that way, and it's certainly not self-evident. And even if they are cosmically trivial, whatever that means, the rocks don't care what you think. Well, who cares what the rocks think? First, they don't think. So I don't see why that's exactly relevant. But even if it's all the same to the cosmos, which is something that I doubt, it's certainly not just all the same to you, you know, because your consciousness has a quality and it matters. Heidegger, for example, who's a philosopher whose writing sort of influenced me post hoc, because I recreated some of the things that he had talked about in the 30s before I knew much about him. But one of the things that Heidegger said was that the fundamental element of human being, of human phenomenology, was care. He said that that's the basic essence of your being, is that you care about things. You know, and that's either negatively or positively, right? To not care about something or to hate it is still to be involved in care. And so, even if the cosmos itself is neutral with regards to our existence, we're not, and we're the only things that we know of that are conscious, and so, well, we might as well go with that. And there's no reason. See, I can't help but think that the constant attempts by people to trivialize the nature of their own consciousness has a dark side. I'm a psychoanalyst, and so I always think that way. It's like, well, first of all, if if you as a being don't matter, then you don't have to do anything. It's a great justification for total lack of responsibility. And that really twigs something for me, because, you know, people who are bent, let's say, or vengeful or angry are always looking for a reason why they don't have to be responsible for anything. Plus it's a lot easier. And so the notion that consciousness is trivial immediately allows you to wander down that path. And so I'm skeptical of those